Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslie Babinski, and I'm the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy here at Duke University. Thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to let you know that after our presentation today, we're going to have some time for a discussion with Dr. da Silva. So please, as you're listening to the presentation, please submit your questions in the chat at any time. And at the end, I'll review the questions and I'll be leading the discussion with Dr. da Silva. So thank you so much for that. Today's event is part of the Early Childhood Initiative series, which was established by the Center for Child and Family Policy to bring together scholars producing cutting-edge research about programs and practices for young children. Our speakers range across a variety of disciplines, but all with a common interest in maximizing the potential of all children during their early childhood years. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christina da Silva, Professor of the Practice of Education at the Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Dr. da Silva specializes in language, literacy, and cultural studies. Her research centers on the teaching and learning of linguistically, culturally, racially diverse students, and on understanding family and community resources in diverse urban contexts, both in and out of school settings, and on partnerships between family, community, school, and university that support and emphasize educational opportunity and equity. She's the author of an edited book called Redesigning Teacher Preparation for Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Young Students, an Ecological Approach. She's been the associate editor of the Journal of Literacy Research and is currently the associate editor of Urban Education Journal. Please join me in welcoming Dr. da Silva.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really honored to be talking with you about work that I have been doing, actually that I'm really passionate about, have dedicated a whole lifetime really of scholarship and practice applied work into early childhood and this particular emphasis on preparing teachers to work with immigrant students and families and communities in early childhood. I am so excited to be here and to see some friendly faces, those whom I have known their work and also have connections with in multiple fronts. So again, thank you for the invitation and thank you for allowing me to share my work that I am so powerfully fueled by. And I'm going to start with a somehow with a provocation that I want us to think about as I'm going to be talking about what are teachers to do in this time of COVID or these times of pandemic or times of intense restrictions, really. And I want to invoke Arundhati Roy's quote when she writes, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between our world and the next. So I want us to think a little bit about the pandemic or these many restrictions that we are under right now in the realm of education as an opportunity, the gift of chaos, if you will. So my presentation is going to provide you with this critical ecological approach that I have been developing and engaging with in teacher preparation for early childhood. And also, I will give you a little bit of the landscape of these current social political circumstances of immigrant and refugee students and families that we need to be mindful of and pay attention to. And then again, with Roy's quote in mind, I want to turn towards an asset-based, praxis-oriented, transcontextual model for immigrant and refugee early childhood teacher education. And then, there are a lot of perhaps abstract terms, and sometimes when we talk conceptually, people want to know, but what does that look like? So I'd like to provide you some examples about what could it look like and what has it looked like in this particular social, political, historical moment. So starting again with what is a critical ecological approach, and thinking a little bit about research and practice. So an ecological approach, many of you probably are familiar with, is an approach that focuses on relations between people in the world and on learning as ways of relating more effectively to people in the world. So it's very relational in nature. And studies informed by an ecological perspective include an investigation of all the dynamic and mutual influences that learners in the surrounding context through semiotic resources. And from this approach, a learner's action is understood in relation to his or her willingness to engage with others in the environment, but also the constraints and affordances of a particular context and its inherent social practices. So thinking about this relational aspect of learning, thinking about particular context that learners are embedded in, and what are the constraints, but in particular, in this case, I want to talk about the affordances. In assembling this critical ecological perspective, I infused Paulo Freire's views on education. Paulo, I'm from Brazil originally, as many of you might know, but and so he's a compatriot, if you will, and but I have been studying his work for a lifetime, and so I wanted to layer that, to laminate Paulo Freire's views on education onto this ecological perspective, to create a critical ecological approach. So Paulo Freire talks about providing a new kind of schooling for those who have suffered injustices on the basis of their racial, ethnic, gender, class, religious, and economic identities, to improve the quality of their everyday lives, to develop critical consciousness, to change the world for the better. And in these ways, what I mean by that is to come to the problem from a different consciousness. I believe that we have to approach problems or issues in education, especially, not from a place where they are created, but from a new ways of envisioning it. And in that, what Paulo Freire called conscientização in Portuguese, it's not just so much a new kind of awareness or even the awareness or a critical awareness as sometimes it is translated, but it's a new kind of consciousness. And Paulo Freire also aims his work to change the status quo through political clarity, courage, and humility. His basic elements for his pedagogy is love for the people, respect for people's ability to shape their own lives. And this is important, I think, nowadays, especially in education, when we try to control so much what is known and what is possible. And so respecting people's abilities to shape their own lives implies to give them the agency to cater to their own needs as supported by educators, and the capacity to value others' experiences. So these are some basic elements of this critical ecological approach. And these are the main concepts that I engage in my research and applied work. So the idea that learning is relational, understanding affordances and constraints of particular environments, and expanding the affordances and minimizing the constraints, and creating community center and a focus on collaborations, working with communities, not for communities or on communities, or but importantly, working in and with communities. Again, this notion of conscientisation, that importance of dialogue, true dialogue, where there is opportunities for listening, especially the redistribution of power, and of course, the notion of praxis, which I will talk a little bit more in just a little bit about. So what are the circumstances of immigrant and refugee students and families in this social, political, and historical moment? So first, who are immigrants and communities in the US? So we have about 46.7 million immigrants currently living in the US, of which about 11 million are undocumented. And they continue coming even through all the restrictions. There are some important push and pull factors that keep them coming. Some of it is situations of war or extreme violence in their home countries. Many of times they come for family reunification and for economic opportunities. And we are seeing more people moving around the world than ever before in history, due to much of what's going on in the world right now. But the US has not been very well receptive of this population, and I'm sure everybody's aware that immigration reform is way overdue. And through the course of doing my work in the US, which has been now, I would say, about 20 years or so, or more actually, we've had very difficult challenges to get through. And in this last decade, especially, and this past administration has really represented a time of terror for immigrants, because of the anti-immigration laws, English-only policies, Operation Streamline, mass incarceration, militarized borders, the wall, which we have been hearing about so much of, many migrant deaths, deportation, overt racism, travel bans, Islamophobia, bigotry, raids in homes, workplaces, places of worship, children's detention, things that we never even fathomed that we would be seeing in the US grounds, and denying immigrants their day in court, family separations. We've seen so many images in the media that have really blasted at us and shocked us, quite frankly. And the use of language as a weapon, as a rhetoric to undermine or dehumanize this population. And then with all of that, there came COVID. And in that, the medical, economic, legal, social circumstances have really aggravated much of the well-being of these communities. And so medically, many of these individuals might be under or uninsured. They might need to work despite of contextual restrictions such as social distancing and so forth. They sometimes are afraid of some legal penalties, and many times they're sharing households with multi-generational folks. And it is also a fact that sometimes they have higher morbidity or mortality rates, and economically, more days of work can represent important housing issues, even evictions and other very challenging situations. Sometimes they are not eligible for employment benefits, and they're suffering food insecurity and a worsening stigma and neglect. So the circumstances are not very positive for this population, and as educators, and especially as early childhood teachers and those who are professionals in the early childhood field, we are bombarded with these challenges. And sometimes we are also really bombarded with the discourse surrounding all of these challenges. And all these challenges sometimes become identities for children and families. And so when they are being introduced as immigrants and refugees, many of these images come to mind, many of these challenges come to mind. And that in and of itself can promote an unwanted or even a not very aware deficit perspective. And so I worked with early childhood pre-service teachers and to create opportunities for them to engage in advocacy praxis. So how do we work with immigrant and refugee communities to promote this this sense that we are all in this together, and how do we work from an asset-based perspective? And so one of the main aspects that we worked very hard on is to begin forging and sustaining trusting relationships with these families and communities. As you might imagine, even in their home countries, it's very difficult for them to trust institutions and failed systems that place them in the circumstances that they find themselves to begin with. And then how do we develop a strength-based, culturally pluralistic, multilingual pedagogies to engage with children in the classroom and in the community? And working towards language and culture as an asset, disrupting English only as the norm, disrupting xenophobia, if you will, and focusing on equity and justice, and supporting immigrant families to engage in advocacy and decision-making process in the partnering schools. So often they don't need us to advocate for them. They are able to advocate for themselves. They need support, and they need our our positionality, if you will, for them to be able to leverage their own advocacy for themselves. And I will show you a little more about that. So this notion of advocacy praxis that we try to impart in our pre-service teachers, especially, as we always work very hard to create this dialectic unity of theory, conceptual understanding, and action. So for us, only conceptual and theoretical knowledge is not enough. We have to put that into action for it to take place and to take effect in the communities that we work with. So for that, we need to commit to the integration of families, communities in school, in theory and research and practice. So not just talk about them as others, but integrating their voices into our research, into our practices, to recreate educational possibility for historically marginalized populations, to counteract these deficit perspectives, and to refine context for learning in a comprehensive way. Again, to engage in these dialectics of awareness and action for transformative possibilities. And for all of that, we have to continuously reimagine teacher education programs to provide opportunities for new perspectives to develop through the engagement in the practices of communities and relationship to its members. So I talked about, how just because we live in the world, we are like fish in water in many ways. And as we hear and we are blasted with images of immigrants having so many challenges and in the ways that they are portrayed in the news, we have to actively and intentionally resist a deficit-oriented perspective. And so for that, we have to look for and understand what are these students' resources. They're enormously resourceful. So what are these resources that they come with? How do we push the boundaries then of what resources actually mean? Resources for whom? And putting things into motion. So especially in times of COVID, where contexts have become, sometimes the physical environment has become restricted, we have to set circulations of materials and ideas and thoughts and languages so that we can set things into motion. Creating more yeses rather than nos, right? So permissions and the flexibility, fluidities of experiences, capacities, and increased capacity of opportunities. And importantly, we must expand axiologies, what is valued. We must expand ontologies. There are many ways of living a life. We must expand epistemologies. There are many ways of knowing. And so sometimes in schools and institutional settings, these are constrained. There's only perhaps one set of things that count. For example, test scores or English or whatever. There is one way to be. And that's homogenized by institutional regulations and rules and so forth. And there is a privileged way of knowing that doesn't account sometimes for of that communities have relied for generations as way of knowing. So to forge forward as resisting a deficit perspective and forge forward an asset-based perspective, we came up with some important learning principles. The first is no dualism between communities and schools. And then learning needs to be seen as ubiquitous, not just within the walls of a school, but it's integrally embedded in everyday experiences. Individuals are co-producers of language, knowledge, cultures, and they are agents, importantly, they are agents in their communities. And it's necessary for learning to happen, for us to understand the diverse socioeconomic, racial, ethnic backgrounds, multi-generational groups participating together in the practices of the communities, learners finding their own negotiated languages and spaces and places for integration of cultures, languages, and voices. And principles then for practice. So we don't come in with answers, but we come in with questions, more questions, and ready to listen and understand what is emergent from these contexts in these local communities. How can we provide now virtual and physical places and spaces for these community integrations? Let's pay attention to expanding conceptions of language in a broad sense. So language counting also as art, counting also as embodied language, and so forth. And really be responsible and responsive for a long-term engagement. Focus on sustainability of these engagements so that we don't come in and out of settings without understanding consequences of our presence there. And present to future orientation. So what is possible is a pedagogy of possibility. And so in this development model, we place community at the center, and we develop research and professional development curriculum materials accordingly to the needs and assets of the community. And our research model has to do with doing learning experiments, offering opportunities for our pre-service teachers to engage in these multiple contexts and to transact around these contexts. So not only being in the classroom for their field experiences, but also being in the communities and, if possible, in engaging with households. So that was one of our big innovations for our pre-service early childhood program. It doesn't come necessarily from a assistentialist perspective, but it comes from a perspective, an anthropological or ethnographic perspective. So our pre-service teachers are placed in partnership with families and communities to learn from them. So they assume the position of a learner in this context. And then there is this prospective phase of debriefing and trying to understand those experiences. So from this ecological critical perspective, we are constantly looking what in this environment makes things happen the way they do. What is available to the person to do something with? How does learning come about relationally within this particular context of activity? How do people shape the environment through language? And how this in turn shapes them as part of a complex, dynamic engagement in the community? And finally, I want to show you a little bit about what does this look like. Now, I want to just keep an eye on the clock here to make sure that I'm still okay on time. But one of the main pieces of this particular time during COVID, with all the restrictions of how can families be in the context of schools right now, how can these partnerships look different? Again, voice quote, how can this be a portal of opportunities? So importantly, setting praxis into motion. So creating new circulations of language and literacies, creating new contexts of action, creating new forms of family and community engagements. And so I'll talk a little bit about what do I mean by creating new circulations of language and literacies, and what does it mean to have families as protagonists of multilingualism and cultural pluralism. So creating spaces where language use is truly an asset, not just a slogan, right? So having stories on the go, creating these opportunities for a portable curricula where you have children sometimes creating photo books, using cameras to take pictures of their life and surroundings so that they can then create books that become part of the classroom library and that reflect their existence and their lived experiences. The family backpacks are backpacks where we have some realia or some objects that would engage families in telling stories. And we also have books that are written by authors that are representative of the cultures that are present in the classroom. So if we have children who just immigrated from Mexico, for example, we would have authentic authors of children's books represented in the backpack, some artifacts for families to use as they interact around the book. And we also have a family diary that helps them write or draw pictures about their interaction or to respond to their interactions with the book and the artifacts. So sometimes families write about their own experiences. This particular backpack that you see here on this picture, the concept was bedtime rituals. And so families would engage with the little artifacts that we had there and would read the books about bedtime rituals from authors that were representative of the countries where they came from. And they would also write their own stories about what bedtime rituals mean to them and what are their bedtime rituals, for example. And on the left of your screen, you see these literacy canastas where families would, again, bring about stories that were important to them. They would sometimes record these stories if they came from oral tradition language where they didn't have scripted language. They often used to just tell stories onto an iPad or whatnot and place it in the basket. And in those ways, we would have student created books. We would have these families creating and recording stories at times, or by drawings, whatnot. They would be remembering, as Cynthia Dillard recently coined the term, meaning becoming a member again of of a community. And how do we create new context for action? So again, trying to set things into motion. Many times we had to hold virtual cafecitos, virtual lunch linkings, as they would call, which are lunch with families in a computer, and also create spaces within schools where sometimes a subgroup of families would be able to come and connect with one another. In this case, they asked for us to create a kitchen for them because they had a garden outside of the school where they harvest some the fruits and created meals. They sold the meals at the school front in their food trucks, and with the money they would buy resources for all children, not just their children. They wanted to be benefactors of the school, not only beneficiary. And other schools would create documentation rooms. They wanted to change the curriculum to a child-centered curriculum, and the district was very much against it. So they created a documentation room where they would exhibit a lot of their children's work in progress in that room. So when district officials would come, they would note the different progress of the children in school. And they also took the opportunity to make a political statement by placing this, what looks like the fence. They had a mural in this room that looked like the fence between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Mexico, and some of their lost relatives. So again, when district officials would come to this room, they not only be informed about their children's progress, they would also be informed about their circumstances. And the statement was one for their own advocacy. And others wanted a space for art. They were really bombarded by many circumstances, and they wanted a space of light and healing. And so we created a place where they could do theater, they could do puppet shows, they could do corridos if they wanted to, or they could do they turned it into a music studio. So they had a refrigerator box that they painted and was very well insulated inside, and it became a fantastic music recording studio for them. In this case in particular, we had people like school bus drivers helping out because they had many skills that were helpful here. And we had the cafeteria folks helping out. So, again, the whole school community invested. Others didn't want a space inside, they wanted a space outside. And so we created a sensory garden for them so that they could walk around the grounds of school, just talking to one another. Some of them at the time were wearing masks, but being outside felt more of a safe environment for them. And lastly, how do we continue to engage in advocacy or in supporting our families towards advocacy? And so one of the main things that they ask for is information, accurate information. And sometimes, again, because we are so embedded in our own environment, in our own context, in our own languages and whatnot, we forget how difficult it is to unveil accurate information and also connect these families with proper organizations and others who can help in some of their necessities. Here's a picture of our family home engagements. Again, these families are all volunteer on a voluntary basis. They all asked for our students to come to their homes. Our students had a lot of revealing opportunities to understand the wealth of knowledge and culture that were present in these households. And a lot of preparation went in beforehand, and also a lot of debriefing afterwards, so that they wouldn't come and leave with more intensified stereotypical ideas about who immigrant and refugee families are. And so, and these were sustained engagements. They were required to go at least 12 times in the course of a year, so that they would establish a relationship with these families, not just an encounter, right? And so, and he is, again, trying to set these things into motion. We found out that many of our families didn't have the necessary technical skills to operate when we all went into remote learning, and that became school. We thought that was going to be just 2 weeks, and all of a sudden that was school. And so I was really touched by this picture, actually, because these teachers just set out these tents, just like the vaccination tents or the testing tents. They set out these tech hubs tents outside where families would go, and they would be tutored on how to use the school district's systems and so forth. And here is, we worked with families who were very concerned because they didn't have sidewalks to walk to school. They didn't have, so on their way to school, they were risking their lives, essentially more than once, by being run over. And so, but they also, many of them were undocumented, and they didn't have the confidence, the political confidence, to ask for what they needed. And so that's one iteration of when our positionality as university faculty and citizens can leverage their needs. And so we created a platform for these, in this case, were all mothers, to speak to county officials and or city officials in this case, and request sidewalks, and they were granted that, and also partner with community organizations that sometimes, again, it's not very transparent for many populations. So how do you harness a lot of these community resources to address some of the issues that you are undergoing? And so how, for example, families create family safety plans. In Tennessee, we have a law that is essentially a racial profiling law, where people can be stopped virtually by no reason, or minor infractions, and be asked for your documents. And so many undocumented immigrants, and I say that in quotes, these people are not undocumented, obviously, in their own country, so that is also a misnomer, but sometimes don't have a driver's license, and they could be detained and deported at the spur of the moment, leaving children behind because many of their children are born and raised in the US. So how do we mediate for some of these circumstances? So finally, I don't know how I'm doing in time, but I think I'm just about to finish here, just as a summary, as a synthesis. What are the aspects of preparing educators for praxis in this, from this critical ecological perspective? So improving opportunities for immigrant families and children through these partnerships of home, school, community, and university, where we prepare new educators to take a learner stance, to learn from these families and these communities, to create spaces within the school grounds that are co-created by families, by community members, by teachers, by pre-service teachers, university faculty and staff to facilitate this integration and engagement. Mobilizing action through partnerships with community organizations, transcontextual and cross-generational supports. Legitimizing immigrant participation in schools. Protecting and advocating for children and families. Promoting immigrant families' agency in decision-making. So not only they're invited in schools and educational communities, they are decision makers in those contexts. Promoting anti-racist stances, centering multilingualism and cultural plurality, again, with a main focus on equity and justice. Establishing and sustaining relationships with immigrant and community, expanding communicative resources, and by that I mean to use interpreters and translators, use embodied practices, use all available accessible technologies, social media, WhatsApp, TikTok, many kinds of opportunities to interact. And so I'll leave you with these. The first quote is actually mine, but the second one is Paulo Freire's. And so with the object of humanizing education, working on the ground and from the ground up. So to humanize education, we must move from abstractions to working on the ground with real people who have real lives, real concerns, who experience real grief, real joy, and have real desires. So for that, we have to suspend a lot of our preconceived ideas about who these families, these students are. And Paulo Freire ultimately says, washing one's hand of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Education is not neutral. And so I'll leave you with those thoughts. And I thank you so much for your attention. I think it's said that one of the biggest gifts that we can give one another is our presence and our attention. And I thank you for this gift.
Thank you, Dr. Da Silva, for that wonderful presentation. I really appreciate those specific examples that you gave us of how you and your colleagues have put these ideas into action. I think many of us are, looking for and craving that roadmap. How do we get to these ideals that you put out for us? I know we have a wide range of participants in today's session, from researchers to educators, district and community leaders. I'd like to encourage our participants to submit questions for Dr. Da Silva in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and jump in, that's an option as well. I can't see everyone on the screen, so I might need my colleagues' assistance in seeing hands raised. But let me just start out by asking you a little bit more about how you put into motion some of these really creative ideas. This idea of helping families and communities advocate for themselves, be decision makers, bring agency. What kind of advice would you give to, say, a school principal or a district leader about creating the appropriate structure or context that allows for this kind of engagement and really breaking down the barriers between our different institutions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Leslie. There are no shortcuts. Let me put it that way. So I think that engaging with these families authentically and listening and really truly learning from them. And when you say, some of the impediments, structural impediments, how can we lower those so that we can have conversation among human beings who are all intentioned to educate children and to protect children and to hopefully improve the qualities of everyday lives for everyone, right? So more practically, I believe that to have a welcoming environment is really important. And this welcoming environment, sometimes it has to be intentional, because again, many of these families have suffered horrendous consequences from institutional systems and structures, not only in their own country, but also at the border and in many other situations in their lives. So the distrust is real. So how do you create trusting opportunities, trusting spaces? In education, sometimes we talk about safe spaces and sometimes we talk about brave spaces. But in this case, it's important for us to understand trusting spaces, spaces where we are really all vulnerable and all humble enough to learn from one another, and breaking the hierarchies relationally is perhaps one of the first steps, and to create, if possible, physical spaces that are especially designated for families as informal and sometimes more formal if they wish to be, spaces for learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really nice way to think about it. Like the physical spaces, what we're trying to do, conceptually, just making this space for families to engage. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of nice questions from our participants. So if we can move to those, and I want to encourage the rest of you, if something's on your mind, or you want to learn more about something that Dr. da Silva has mentioned, go ahead and put them in the chat. So we have a question about, is there a list of agencies to access authentic texts and resources? For instance, books that are not mere translations, but authentically rooted in both language and culture of the countries of origin.
Yes, before I was here at Vanderbilt, I was at the University of Arizona, where fortunately we had one of the world's biggest international libraries of children's book in the world. And there are two of them, and one of them was there at the University of Arizona. And they are a wonderful resource. I encourage you to look into their website. They have a well cataloged with this children's literature worldwide, and by authentic authors from these different countries. So that's one of them. And I encourage you also to create resource books of community organizations in your areas that families can readily access, and that you can readily connect with. In these cases, it's important that we are really all working together and not just, again, creating silos or ivory towers, if you will. So it's being out there in the community and creating these partnerships is sometimes a matter of life and death for this population.
Mm. Good point. Our next question from the audience: how do we protect teachers who are afraid to take an anti-racist stance on behalf of the families they serve in a dangerous political dynamic that we have now?
What a good question. It is
Right.
that. It is, many states have already issued bills that are, again, controlling discourse in the classroom, so that different um, different conversations will be privileged and others will disappear or erased or be erased. And so as teachers and educators, we have to resist that. And as somebody who comes from a military regime, and that's largely how I ended up in the US and escaping the military regime, escaping an autocratic regime. This is very familiar and somewhat triggering for me, quite frankly, this need for control, and control not only of curriculum, but the control of language and conversation. So we have to resist that, actively resist that. And I know that for teachers, sometimes their jobs are on the line. But when we begin in thought, ideas, and in language, we are getting into a very difficult situation. But that said, I do want to leave you with a possibility of again, engaging with families and students outside of school grounds, in the community, being in the community. It is one way that you can circumvent some of these restrictions. And I would also encourage, administrators and district officials who might be on the line also, to really examine who is this favoring, and how can we disrupt injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. What a difficult time for teachers and schools and all of our communities. In thinking about disruptions, and you mentioned, earlier in the presentation about the disruption of the pandemic and the opportunity out of chaos, what are some things that happened during the pandemic that that opened up those opportunities that you hope may continue? What are some of those possibilities that you see going forward?
So, in some ways, we were all, restricted in our physical spaces, but it forced us to be more creative in creating opportunities for connections such as this one that we are right now, right? So having these video conferences, and actually in preparation for this talk, I have been more intentional about interviewing teachers, early childhood teachers, especially in this last several months, asking that very question, Leslie. And so they tell me that, in some ways they are making do, and teachers are famous for making do, for being flexible, for creating new possibilities out of thin air. And like the tent that they had set outside in various places of town to instruct families on how to use the district's technologies. So now we have more of an access to people's homes through this technology. We have the opportunity to message with using cell phones, and have video tapes and photographs and so forth. My pre-service teachers here are intensely documenting a lot of the children's activities in the class, and having these really open relationships with families, even though remotely. But what I want to again emphasize, and it's something that we have talked about, that it should not fall only in the shoulders of teachers. Teachers are exhausted. They are leaving the profession, unfortunately, because they are under so many demands and so much pressure. And so we need to really care for our teachers now and create systems and structures that allows them to do what they do best, which is to be flexible, to make do, to attend to children, to be responsive. I have no question that teachers have that at heart. I'm a teacher myself, and by identity, a kindergarten teacher for many years. So, so yeah, I think that's a start.
Thank you so much. That's a good note to end it on, that we all need to support our teachers. Yes, I can't see who that is though.
It's Ann Brewster. I think I've got myself on video, but in any case, thank you so much. Hello, how are you?
Hi, and it's the proud mother of one of my dear students, current students, and it's so nice to see you. And I have many things to say about Julia. So, but right now, just notice my smile. I really adore her.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and especially to bring, our attention to immigrant issues and specifically the perspectives that you bring. And Paulo Freire's work never will go out of style. So thank you. And a question that I have actually is, I work with high school students. So do you have any experiences that relate to high school students and these issues?
So I have actually something here that I took out of the presentation, but we do a lot of intergenerational coaching, if you will. So high school students working with early childhood students and doing this reading with them and doing this transportable books with each other, and but essentially relating their experiences with one another. And a project that we are engaging here right now has to do with improv theater and with what we call playback theater. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it is a kind of activity that engages with ways to attenuate trauma. And so from a more of an asset perspective. And so that is ongoing right now. We are in a high school right now working with unaccompanied minors who are here in Nashville, and through this lens of theater and improvisation.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person.
Oh, me too. I can't wait.
Yes,
we have a lot in common. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Da Silva, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Please click on the link in the chat from Erica to give us feedback on today's event. And before we close, I'd like to invite all of you to attend our conference that's coming up in 2 weeks called The Next Step in Early Childhood Policy, Creating a Universal System of Care for Families with Young Children. It's on April 12th, which is an all-day national virtual conference, and April 13th, which is a North Carolina in-person focused event. And we'd love for you all to join us. Thank you again for attending today's session, and thank you to Dr. Da Silva.